Well, good afternoon. I'm Mary Janow, Dean of SIPA, and it's my enormous pleasure to moderate this afternoon's conversation with four remarkable experts discussing the U.S. election and U.S. foreign policy broadly. Of course, we're doing this at this moment before the election outcome has been called. And it could happen in the middle of our webinar, in which case Susan Glasser, who is an active journalist, might step off, and so I'll warn you in advance. I'm really delighted to have you with us. She's a staff writer at The New Yorker, writes a weekly column on life in Washington, but she's been a top editor of major Washington publications. She founded the award-winning Politico magazine. She was previously editor-in-chief of foreign policy. She worked for a decade at the Washington Post. She's written several books, including a great new book, The Man Who Ran Washington, Congratulations, which she co-wrote with her husband, Peter Baker, on Secretary James Baker. So thank you, Susan. You've joined us a few times in recent years, and I'm always grateful for your participation. So great to have you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be with you.
And Stephen Sestanovich, who is a long-serving, very distinguished member of our faculty, the Catherine and Shelby Cullum Davis Professor of International Diplomacy, and he's also the director of our International Fellows Program. He's had a very distinguished and diverse professional career. He served in government several times. I won't go through all of those periods, but he's had really very senior roles in the State Department, responsible for Russia and Eurasia, previously at the Carnegie Endowment. His principal research interests include Russia and post-Soviet politics, American foreign policy. He's also the George Kennan Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and wrote a great book on U.S. Foreign policy. So Steve, wonderful to have you with us.
Thanks,
and Stephen Biddle, Professor of International Public Affairs at SIPA. And he too has had a career that has spanned the academy as well as policy positions. He has served on the Defense Department's Defense Science Board. He was on General David Petraeus's Joint Strategic Assessment Team in Baghdad. He's been a senior advisor to the Central Command. He wrote a really groundbreaking seminal work called Military Power. And he joined our faculty in 2018. Much more to be said, but delighted you're with us today, Stephen Biddle. Thank you for being here.
My pleasure.
And also Tom Christensen. Professor Christensen is a professor of public international affairs at SIPA and also director of the China and the World program at Columbia. He joined us in 2018 from Princeton and brought the Great China and the World program, which is a collaboration with Harvard, to Columbia and SIPA. He also served a period in government as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia, and is a great China expert. He's written a number of books, including a most recent book called The China Challenge, which was the editor's choice of the New York Times Book Review. Much more could be said about all of our speakers, but let us just get straight into the moment we're living together. And I think before we talk about what differences we might expect from different outcomes to this presidential race, perhaps I could just invite each of you to quickly orient us with what you see as the major foreign policy challenges and risks facing the United States, irrespective of who is president. Could I invite Susan to get us started?
Well, thank you so much. It's really great to be with you again. And obviously on such a day, I guess I will finally get rid of my rule of refusing to discuss Joe Biden's presidency. So I'm happy now to engage in that conversation and have this be the first one. I really have. I've not read any of those stories about the Biden cabinet or about the transition. I guess a new phase commences. Look, the bottom line is, as you said, in some ways, irrespective of who is the president, the U.S. faces a set of an international landscape and a set of security challenges that either one would have to reckon with. But to my mind, the greatest sort of geopolitical story remains here looking in the United States and on the question of what kind of a superpower the United States is going to be going forward. Its willingness and ability to engage with the rest of the world, to project international power. Certainly, it appears we'll have a president who is more oriented towards international diplomacy, alliances, multilateral organizations, and the like. But there's really absolutely no consensus because we have an election that did not revolve around issues of foreign policy and international affairs. I think this is an unresolved question and therefore crisis for the world about what to do when its strongest power is very uncertain about its role in the world. So to me, that remains the through line from the Trump to the potential Biden presidency.
Thank you very much. Tom, could I invite you?
Yeah, I think, the same problems that we face, which is a rising China and a changing Asia, are really important challenges for the new administration. And I think, as Susan suggested, they will try to work through multilateral organizations in the region much more than the Trump administration did. They'll try to rebuild some of the mistrust and the alliances with our traditional allies in the Asia Pacific. And I think that they'll run into some problems along the way, along the lines that Susan said, because one of the ways to improve the security relationship with all of those actors would be to engage with them in their trade negotiations, which have really deepened in the region, not just the TPP, but the RCEP, the one that has China in it. And I'm not so sure there's a domestic base for that kind of re-entry into, say, TPP negotiations. And I didn't get an impression from the Biden campaign that there was a big push to re-engage in that kind of what's been labeled the sort of neoliberal mission.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much. Stephen Biddle?
Yeah, I mean, I would echo what Tom said about the significance of rising China and what Susan said about the importance of American domestic politics. I think Steve Sestanovich is going to talk about the rising salience of the pandemic and health issues in American foreign policy. So I'll leave that to him. The one point I would add to all this is when we teach grand strategy, we make the argument that grand strategy has military and non-military elements, and some of those non-military elements are domestic politics. And the domestic politics of the United States emerging from this election are going to have a powerful influence on what kind of foreign policy we have going forward and our ability even to have a foreign policy going forward. If a Republican Senate decides to take the stance towards a Biden presidency that the Republican Senate took towards the Obama presidency, right? Stonewall, refuse action in order to deny the president any victories that he could use for re-election as a way of ensuring that the maximum prospect of a one-term presidency is realized. If Mitch McConnell takes that policy going forward, we will, in the eyes of the world, increasingly approximate a failed state. We'll be unable to make decisions, we'll be unable to pass legislation, we'll be unable to respond to domestic problems like a pandemic and a threat to our economy, and our ability to respond with the kind of institutionalist agenda that I think Biden and his advisors have in their bones is going to be very, very limited. And I think others are going to look at us and view us increasingly in that scenario as a helpless actor, and the ability of the United States to act as a model for democratic governance overseas will evaporate. I think there is some reason to hope, in light of what the Senate Majority Leader has been saying just since Election Day, that he doesn't want that he doesn't want to be the majority leader of a dysfunctional nation and burn the house down, but is perhaps willing to be more productive. That decision that Mitch McConnell makes, and that decision that the leadership of the Republican Party makes in their control of the Senate, will have enormous influence for America's role in the world and America's foreign policy going forward.
Thank you very much. Steve Sestanovich.
I haven't heard anything yet that I disagree with. Let me say, though, that the urgency of the pandemic and the prospect of a global depression probably helps Biden in the sense that it makes it harder for people just to say, we are going to be blocking you at every turn. He has the advantage of coming in with tremendous international crises facing him. And that means that his message of national unity is going to resonate in some ways. But he does face the problem which presidents coming in after a period of retrenchment always face, which is how to find a new formula for activist foreign policy that enjoys support both internationally and domestically. We've seen this before. You know, American presidents don't just revert to a previous concept of what the national role, the international role of the United States should be. They generally find the innovation, the tweaks to that role that makes it seem more relevant and makes it seem more likely to avoid past mistakes. So Kennedy did that, Reagan did that. In their different ways, Clinton and Bush did that. Biden's challenge is going to be to find a way to build a consensus for American foreign policy that seems to offer better results, to be really blunt about it, than President Obama got. The Obama administration record has its strong points and its weak points, but I think Biden knows that he's going to have to do better. He's become president in part because he was part of the Obama administration, but he faces the requirement to show that he can produce better results.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much. I'd like to pick up on a couple of these great interventions that start us off. And Susan, if I may, since you have been living Washington inside and thinking about how domestic politics affects foreign policy, could I invite you to pick up the invitation from Stephen Biddle to imagine if we have a Republican Senate, what that means for the ability to formulate and execute a foreign policy?
Well, you know, the striking thing, right, is not that it's much easier than it seems at this moment to come up with a list of things that one could imagine there's a broad bipartisan consensus on. The challenge is that it's actually hard to find the place where the politics push in that direction, right? It's not just as in our domestic politics, actually, right? There's an enormous national consensus that you can get 80% of the public supports a big new coronavirus relief bill. 80% of the public, you know, can support an infrastructure bill, and yet they don't happen. And I think the same is true on the foreign policy front. For example, you know, there has been, in some ways, Trump has pushed the Republican Senate to be even more kind of staunch in its views about the importance of NATO and the importance of a kind of unified front when it comes to confronting Russia in Eastern Europe, right? In a way, he sort of shored up their resolve as they became the bulwark against his desire for an opening with Vladimir Putin. So it's not that there aren't bipartisan areas. The question is, you know, the sort of essentially scorched earth politics that were practiced by the Republican Senate in the Obama years, and Biden will be shaped and scarred by that period of time. You know, so it's really about the will to proceed. I do agree with Steve, and I've thought for a long time that the coronavirus, and especially with the prospect that next year we're even more focused on some of the international implications, both in public health terms, also in economic terms, the impact of it if a vaccine materializes, the question of distribution. Can Biden not only join the international effort, which Trump has refused to, rejoin the World Health Organization, use that as an early way to assert that America is back? That might be backed in a bipartisan way, which again could give some momentum to the idea that you can trust America again, because I still come down to the idea that it's not so much about the individual policy fights as it is about the crisis in confidence, both internally in the United States and then internationally, about the United States, and are we good for our word? What's the point of negotiating with us if 4 years from now someone's going to just throw it out? Then absolutely any bad actor knows how to play that. And so in that sense, perhaps the Republican Senate would climb on board something early on, because I think that's going to be really crucial, what happens in those first few months.
Mm-hmm. Tom, would you like to weigh in here? I know you've been thinking about particularly about China and dealing with China, but also about expanding multilateralism. And could I invite you to speculate, if you would, not only about what the opportunity is, but how do you fashion that argument to do it in light of the shifts that have happened in American attitudes, which are increasingly concerned about China and China in the world?
Yeah, it's a great question, because the organizations that I think the Biden administration will have every incentive and desire to re-engage are the World Health Organization first, because you're in the COVID crisis. The second is the Paris Agreement on climate, and I expect them to want to re-engage there for obvious reasons. And then a third one is multilateral negotiations on Iran. And I expect them to want to re-engage there. That's where their instincts lie. But on all of those things, there are potential potholes along the lines that Steve Biddle and Susan have laid out, and also Steve Sestanovich, which is they're all controversial for various reasons that have been caught up in American domestic politics. And they all involve China, which is always controversial in American domestic politics. But I think there is a way to craft it. So in the World Health Organization, if they craft it cleverly, they'll be saying, we need to re-enter that organization so that China doesn't take it over. In other words, we need to assert American interests within the organization. Otherwise, we're ceding the field to a rising China. So stated as a way of countering China, even though while you're in the WHO, you'll be engaging it. The same with the Paris Agreement, that there are various things that China is doing abroad in terms of climate change that are not just at home. They're building coal-fired power plants all through Asia. And you can make the argument, the only way we can get a multilateral group together to counter this Chinese activity is to re-engage with the multilateral organization. And I would say the same with Iran. A lot of people forget that the biggest economic benefactor of Iran is China. So again, if it's pitched in a way that if we don't do this, China's just going to go along its way supporting Iran and will feel no multilateral pressure to adjust its policies towards Iran, then maybe they can sell it to at least parts of the Republican Senate. I think there are Republican senators who could listen to that. And they only need to win over some of them because the majority in the Senate is not very robust. So I think it's doable, but I think it's a big challenge.
Mm-hmm.
Could I interject something on this point? Because I think the framing is important. Multilateralism is not a popular term in American politics, but working with allies is always good.
Yeah.
And so the formula that I think Tom is exactly right about casting a lot of these things as a way of containing China. That's going to work, but the description of it is we have to revitalize an American bloc that works effectively within such formats, basically shoulder to shoulder with allies, and then I think you can defend the process even if the results are sometimes slow in coming.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to get back to that, but Stephen Biddle, if you don't mind, would you say a word more about the Iran agreement? If that's something you've been thinking about, does it make sense to go back to it? That one, I think, now time has passed. There was a short-term moratorium they've committed to. They have not been, obviously bound by that. Does it make sense to go back to that?
I think it does, and I think the Biden people think it does. I think there's a substantial amount of support internationally for some kind of agreement to constrain what Iran is doing. The Iranians talk a variety of games, but I think they're willing to return to some kind of deal that involves meaningful sanction relief as a result. I think this is a situation where the Trump administration was very much an outlier and was determined to blow this up in the face of massive support from all sorts of corners for something like continuation of the deal. The Iranians may very well decide that they have leverage now to try and drive a harder bargain. You know, the Trump administration is the gift that keeps on giving, right? But my guess is that there's an opportunity here to restore some sort of negotiated, agreed framework for constraining this program as it goes forward. I also want to take the opportunity to pile on what my fellow Steve and my colleague Tom were saying about the domestic politics of this. That one of the very few items of real consensus in this last campaign was anti-China rhetoric. In an important sense, both Biden and Trump were trying to outdo each other in how aggressively they could position themselves as counter to a rising China. There are all sorts of issues about what China's intentions are, how appropriate this kind of containment frame is, and all that. But Steve Sestanovich's point and Tom's point about the jujitsu potential here is very, very important. If the Democratic Party approaches the U.S. role in the world the way it has historically, that we're about openness, the Democrats are about globalization, the Democrats are about multilateralism, they're about international institutions. There's a widespread view among the part of the American population that almost reelected Donald Trump that this is selling out average everyday Americans for the sake of globalist elites. And this has caused a massive realignment of American politics away from big government versus small government and towards populist nationalism and open globalism as the central fault line in American politics. If Democrats allow themselves to get painted as the elitist globalists, we're headed for another train wreck 4 years from now. And the American role in the world might not survive another one of these. So a central challenge for the Democratic Party's foreign policy program broadly specified is exactly the one Stephen Sestanovich identified. They have got to build a domestic constituency for a role in the world that they have in mind. If it turns out that the way to do that is frame multilateralism, frame institutionalism, frame concern with foreigners as part and parcel of opposing a rising China, you get an odd echo of the Cold War in which a lot of American domestic policy could be framed in light of a superpower bipolar global competition that could motivate a lot of Americans to support and participate in this project in a way that they do not when they view this as a way to enrich rich elites at the expense of Main Street America that's being sold out, to all these foreign interests.
Mary, can I say one thing on that, just to follow up with Steve? There's only one problem with it, and it gets back to my TPP discussion before, which is that if the United States pitches it too strongly as a new Cold War, they'll lose all the allies they're supposedly building. Right. Because nobody else has a stomach for that. And the Trump administration basically announced a Cold War in July of this year, and nobody showed up. None of our closest allies wanted any piece of it. Yeah. And so I think it's a challenge. And the best way is to say we need to have a coalition to constrain China or something. But if we use the word contain and we use Cold War rhetoric, we'll lose the very allies we need in that process.
Yeah, so we're going to open this up for questions in a little while. So I'd like to invite our attendees to please feel free to submit some questions, and we'll try to turn to them in a few minutes. But let me pick up this point and ask you, what will we achieve by working with our allies? We've talked a lot about America's standing in the world, America's credibility. Being viewed as a reliable partner. But, if we try to operationalize this idea of working with our allies, what are we going to work with them to achieve that would have some resonance at home, do you think?
I'm really glad you asked that, because I think that is the biggest problem, is that it's much easier to achieve a sort of, strategic consensus than it is to imagine what a program actually is going to consist of for Biden presidency. From the beginning, that's been my concern, listening to him. He gave a speech at Munich Security Conference right before he announced his presidential campaign that was essentially his opening bid on foreign policy. But what did he say? He said, we'll be back. And I think that at the moment, I haven't heard from Biden. I mean, he has excellent and capable advisors, but the truth is, essentially he's offering multilateralism, not called that per Steve, but, working with allies as an end in and of itself. What Trump had going for him was a certain brute clarity. And it wasn't consistency, but it was clear. The Iran deal was the worst ever. We're going to get out of it. The Paris Climate Accord was the worst deal ever. We're going to get out of it. NAFTA was the worst deal ever. We're going to get out of it. Every single person listening to this can tell you what his agenda was. And that is not the case right now, in a way that I think is very concerning. It is a warning sign, especially because I thought what Steve just had to say was so smart and so right on the mark as far as the political challenge of a democratic kind of revanchist foreign policy simply being seen as a return to the status quo ante and, like globalism for the benefit of the few and not the many. And I think that's the default setting, for former Vice President Biden. I think it's a default setting for many of those who work with him, not in a bad sense, but I don't think that either they have imagined a future of concrete new accomplishments, or that they believe, even if they have, that there's a consensus in American society that would enable them to pursue those. And so if you had to say like a number one concern that I would have going into this, it's exactly what your question was. I can't tell you on the day, 2 days after the election is over, I cannot tell you what the goal is besides undoing the things that were done.
Well, let me take up one dimension, and thank you very much for that reaction, and all of you. It's extremely interesting. I would assert that the ability of the United States to affect behavior of China is less than it used to be, and that isn't just a Trump phenomenon; it's the rise of China. But that the assertion that to the extent that the US can identify actions and our allies are of a shared view, it's more likely to have some influence than the opposite. Now, but then when you start getting specific, what are those measures? They're not quick fixes, and they take time. But I'm curious how Tom thinks about influencing China.
Well, there's a whole range of issues on which we would try to influence China, and it's always more helpful to do it with others. One of them is whether China is going to settle its many sovereignty disputes in East Asia through the use of force or the threat of the use of force. And they are having good relations with Southeast Asian partners, not always allies, good relations with the ASEAN organization, and good relations with our allies is always essential so that we're not going into that problem set alone. And we have to diversify our military presence in East Asia to move away from very large vulnerable bases. We're going to need a lot of political cooperation in order to do that effectively moving forward. And that seems to be a kind of Pentagon consensus that we need to do that. We have to have other capitals agreeing to allow us to do that kind of nimble, more mobile presence in the region. So all of those things would be helped by that. And then there are non-proliferation issues like Iran and North Korea, where China is the biggest benefactor of both Iran and North Korea. And there's simply no way to pressure either country without the use of actual kinetic force, which no one seems to want, without China's cooperation in some form. And it's much easier to get China on board when a bunch of other actors that China cares about in its diplomatic portfolio are on board with you, so that China looks like the odd man out, China looks like the troublemaker, China looks like the problem if you can't get pressure on those regimes when they act badly. That's a much better way to go than just going at China alone. So I don't disagree that China is a challenge, and I don't disagree that we have to be firm and strong in the region, but there are smart ways to do it and less smart ways to do it. And I think that they're lined up for this, but I get back to your world, Merritt, and I want to ask you a question, which is, a big part of building those relationships would be getting engaged in those international economic, not just trade, but the TPP is an economic set of understandings that Japan has taken the lead on, and we're absent. And can we get back in there, given the factors that Susan and Steve Biddle have raised and Steve Sestanovich about the domestic consensus that's necessary to really engage seriously in new economic agreements?
Well, I'll just offer one comment on that, and that is, that it's my impression that the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement that was negotiated by the Trump administration and supported by the Congress did incorporate many, many features of TPP and went beyond it in some dimensions. So I think we have a template there that could be picked up and an argument made if the administration would want to spend the political capital on that agenda. Because trade is always difficult in the current environment. And so it's really a question of, is this going to be a priority? But I think there's that the TPP, which has gone forward under Japan, moving it forward, and the U.S.-Mexico agreement now really provides a foundation for going forward if they wish to try and re-engage on those issues. But let me get back to the security issues for a moment and invite Stephen Biddle to comment on this working with our allies. I just don't want to lose your voice on that, working with our allies on security before we move on.
Well, I mean, working with allies brings you two important advantages and a variety of disadvantages. The most important advantages it brings you are capability aggregation and legitimacy. So when you combine the United States defense budget with NATO's defense budget, you get the majority of all military spending on the planet. The United States classically has enjoyed this tremendous advantage of large, stable alliances with rich, militarily powerful allies, which puts at our disposal a scale of military effort that has long, basically since the end of the Cold War, has dwarfed any major challenger. The other big advantage that working with allies provides for your security is it brings legitimacy. There's a general sense among a lot of audiences in the United States as well as overseas that unilateralism is dangerously likely to be a realization of the self-interest of a single self-interested power. But that the more people who collectively act, the lower the likelihood that this action is a reflection of single self-interest, of single self-interested powers. So we bring those big advantages when we work through NATO or when we work through a hub and spokes alliance system in Asia. The big disadvantage is reduced freedom of action. Right? The United States declined NATO's offer of assistance after 2001 when bin Laden hit the trade towers. NATO came forward and offered to frame this as a realization of the Title V obligation of all NATO allies to defend any NATO ally who's attacked. And the Bush administration said, no, thanks. We'll get back to you later on this, because they didn't want the restriction of freedom of action that came with it. But restriction of freedom of action and legitimacy are two parts of exactly the same coin. You get the legitimacy because you're accepting the restriction of freedom of action, because you're saying that we are not going to do whatever we jolly well please. We're going to allow a bunch of other NATO states to have some influence over what we do. If you combine those things, you get potentially a valuable way forward, but alliances have upsides and they have downsides. That gets back to this question of whether the American public will go along with it. All right, so in principle, the American public likes allies. Steve Sestanovich is exactly right on that point. In practice, they're not real happy about any particular alliance. It was pretty easy for Donald Trump to sell an argument that NATO is stiffing us. Right, the burdens are being unfairly shared, and all these effete European intellectuals are taking advantage of we, blood and soil Americans. Right, it's important to make the case, if you're going to work through alliances, if you're going to work through other international institutions like the Trans-Pacific Partnership or elsewhere, that this is in American interest, and that this isn't just a sellout to a bunch of foreigners who don't want what America wants. That gets us back to this problem, and the problem in the politics of the Cold War analogy.
Yeah.
Like Tom, I'm very concerned about a simplistic Cold War frame for looking at US-China relationships. But as somebody who lived through the Cold War, there was a distinct debate within the Cold War about just how threatening is the Soviet Union and just how consistently oppositional should Western policy be towards it. And our allies were consistently worried that the United States was going to chain gang them into an unnecessary war with the Soviets. And the whole warp and woof of Cold War alliance politics was this tug of war. We're headed towards the same thing vis-a-vis China, where there are going to be very important shades of disagreement in the United States about how challenging is China as a national security issue for the United States. And there are going to be important strains between the US and our allies with respect to how aggressive are we going to be vis-a-vis China. But given the importance of domestic political constituency for what we do in the world, I think it's going to be very hard for any American president who wants to take a forceful multilateral role in the world to avoid somehow or another motivating this by an issue that motivates passions domestically within the United States. And the old globalist openness argument ain't going to do it anymore.
But I would submit to you that that for some time, U.S. senior officials have argued, we will act alone when it's in our interest to do so, and we will act with our allies when it's in our interest to do so. And so maybe this is the time when, we should be able to find, a multi-pronged approach, to guide us forward. It's not multilateralism for its own sake. It's not working with our allies for its own sake. It's doing so when it makes sense and it's more powerful and effective to do so. But I would like to invite, what we haven't talked about enough maybe is Russia. And, Steve, you are an absolute expert. We've had, to me, a quite mysterious Russia policy these last few years. What should be our Russia policy?
Well, Merritt, let me just first say that I'm really glad that you raised the question of what you get from working with allies that matters to the adversaries as opposed to just what matters to American public opinion, because that other audience is important. And I would say that Putin will be looking to see whether Biden can actually make something of the wreckage of the Western alliance and reassert a kind of unified front there that he will have to take into account. And I think that will matter on energy policy. There's this continuing controversy about pipelines. It'll matter on Ukraine. What kind of unity is there among Western governments in supporting Ukraine? That will matter to Putin. Steve Biddle mentioned spending. I think oddly enough, Trump was a beneficiary of Obama's policy in getting the Europeans to do more, to spend more. But Biden may be a beneficiary of Trump's policy because he can also show to the Europeans, I just need you to do a little bit better. Quickly to answer your question about Russia policy, I think there's likely to be a sort of good news and bad news side of this for Putin. The good news is Biden will right away renew the New START treaty, and that will seem like an affirmation of a big two view of the world. It's something that he's tried to get out of Trump for the past year and failed to do. The bad news, I think, is that all in all, Russia may be downgraded in a Biden administration. Of all of the things they've got to cope with, actually, Russia just doesn't loom very large. So they may be willing to make the gesture of renewing, because it's a kind of stabilizing feature, this major strategic arms control treaty. But in other ways, I think they're probably going to be paying less attention to Russia. you're certainly not going to get any early Biden-Putin summit. That's for sure. That kind of show business is out. The kind of work that you do with the Russians is going to have to be at lower levels because Putin is toxic.
Thank you. Okay, so why don't we invite a few questions? I see a few here, and if I can read them, I will try and do so. Let me start us off with a question from one of our attendees that essentially asks, isn't it troubling that the public doesn't understand the need for globalization that could be beneficial in the long run? How do you educate so that we don't get caught up in false narratives about what we're doing? Anyone wish to comment on that?
I'll say something, Mary. I think it's really important to recognize two things. And one is that globalization and transnational production chains that came out of globalization have been a major source of global wealth, and that world starvation and real poverty have gone down dramatically in the last 30 to 40 years to a point that would have been unimaginable 30 or 40 years ago. A second point is that globalization, I believe, and I think it's demonstrable, has been a major force for peace. Because you have these complex transnational production chains in places like East Asia, the actors who have the sovereignty disputes are very reluctant to go to military force over their sovereignty disputes because it would be so damaging to their economies because transnational production chains are relatively fragile. And the third thing I would say, and I wish someone would make this argument because I'll show my cards. I am a globalist, and I do believe that globalization has been a good thing and that those institutions that brought it about were a good thing. I think that someone needs to make the case that the problems of globalization for the United States are problems in our domestic policies, that we're not making the proper domestic adjustments for a globalized world. It's not that we should have fewer trade and economic agreements. It's that we should do a better job at home of adjusting things so that the people who get hurt by international cooperation have a better shake. And that will create a more competitive environment. And if we can teach people those three things, I think it is sellable. It all seems very logical to me. And we make it sound like we're in the worst of times ever. And maybe that's the pandemic speaking, but we're in the best of times ever by lots and lots of metrics. Very low interstate conflict, very low starvation. Before the pandemic, very high growth rates in places like Africa. So it's been a pretty good success story. But I think Americans have a tendency to find failure in a large group of success stories.
Can I just add quickly? I mean, I take your point, but selling altruism, selling the idea, that of goodness is unfortunately coming out and into a moment which you have tens of millions of Americans have just voted for fear, division, and not that view of the world. They voted for a dystopic vision of American carnage in which everyone benefits at our expense. And
yeah, so that's where the education comes in.
I'm not saying that means that all those voters voted for every particular, obviously, of the current president's behavior and attitude, but I think fundamentally, actually, what they did vote for is this notion of being screwed by a globalist elite and a current world order. And I don't think saying, people in Africa are getting better is going to change that consensus. And my fear, in fact, is that, again, it is what it is and the alternatives were what we had, but just selling people on the idea that we're just going to go back to what it was before is the biggest risk factor that I see right now.
Right, Susan. So I would just come back and say my response would be that you have to build in a domestic program so that people don't feel like they're getting the short end of the stick every time. It has to be a package. It can't just be we're returning to the globalist agenda. But I think a case can be made that the U.S. has benefited economically from that globalist agenda directly too. But the people who have been hurt have not been helped in the proper way. But the solution to that is not to not have a WTO. The solution to that is to have a better domestic program.
Again, I actually totally agree with you, but all I'm saying is I've heard people make that case for years. And, Barack Obama's a pretty good communicator and he made that case. And I don't think he won that argument with enough people.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, one of the China dimensions of this that I think has emerged in the Biden campaign was not that we'd be tough on China, but we'd also be, quote, smart on China. And that means, reinvest in American R&D, et cetera, get our own house in order in a different way. And that's a way, I think, of responding perhaps to part of what Susan is raising. If it actually turns into action, we could have had an infrastructure bill under the Trump administration. It was also applauded as an important priority. So it's a puzzle whether we will get the support we need for that kind of response. Excuse me for editorializing. One more question that I'd like to bring up, combine a couple of questions. One of the questions asks, where do we think US-India relations will feature? And another question sort of says, in a US-China world where we're trying to manage US-China relations, what does relations with other countries like Malaysia or Indonesia, how do those countries feature? Would anyone wish to comment on India to begin? Okay.
I could, but I've spoken a lot. So if someone else wants to comment.
All right. Or other countries in Asia. Can you imagine a stepped up? Maybe Tom,
so India and Malaysia, maybe two countries that have similarities. India has real security concerns about the rising China, and we have real opportunities with India. We have real opportunities with the Southeast Asian disputants and the South China Sea maritime disputes as well. But to do that successfully, to use those relationships as leverage to try to shape China's behavior towards the outside world, you really can't portray the relationship between the United States and China as a zero-sum Cold War struggle. So that's the challenge, is how do you get those countries on board? They trust the United States more than they trust China in general. We can work with them on a range of things that can benefit the United States. And this gets to Susan's point, the stuff that I was talking about, it's really beneficial to the United States directly when it's pitched properly, but it can't be sold too simplistically because you alienate those countries who are economically dependent on China. And they don't want a Cold War with China. They just want to confront China on certain issues. You lose them when you paint it as a Cold War. So there's that enormous tension between what works on Capitol Hill to get support for the policies that you're trying to push and what works in the region. And the Trump administration doubled down on Cold War rhetoric. And I was in Southeast Asia in late 2019 when you could still do that. And it was selling not at all. So we need to move away from these arguments that these countries are all victims of predatory diplomacy, economic diplomacy by China, because when you call countries prey, they tend to not like it. So when you go to Malaysia and you go to Vietnam and you go to India and you say you're being preyed upon, you're basically, to their ears, you're saying, you're saying we're idiots, that we can't cut our own economic deals. So we have to move away from that and offer something more competitive and look at it as a positive sum competition with China, not purely a zero sum one. And we'll get a lot further and we'll be more powerful than China in the process.
Merritt, could I add one word to that?
Of course.
I was interested in the Trump administration's effort to create this quad, the US, Japan, Australia, and India. And I thought they were sure to blow it with the excess rhetoric that Tom has described. But in fact, all the governments turned out to be rather receptive to the idea. I was talking to a Japanese diplomat yesterday who said, oh yeah, the Quad, we're considering that to be a legacy of the Trump administration that actually can be kind of positive for us. So I totally agree with Tom that it is important to be very aware of the conflicting interests that states in the region have, because China's everybody's number one trading partner. And yet, I think what the Trump administration showed is that there's quite a lot of receptivity on the security front toward cooperation.
Okay, thank you. Susan, maybe this question is directed at you, but others should feel free. There's a question that asks, what do we expect the Biden administration's policy to be towards big tech? And would that have any foreign policy implications?
So that is an interesting question, because I think that's another area where there has been a bipartisan souring in Washington, certainly towards Silicon Valley. That's notable. If the early Obama years were characterized by this romance between the Democrats and Silicon Valley and big tech, now I think you have a very, very sour taste. Certainly you can hear President Trump and what he thinks, but it's also true among Democrats, especially a lot of backlash toward Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg, but not limited to that. And just in a much more overall sanguine view of, what might have been previously a much more, utopian welcome of these technologies. And so I think that's also where you see Democrats on Capitol Hill. They have a lot of energy around this issue. So I would expect that there would be a significant new interest in regulatory action that involved all of the tech giants, again, not limited to Facebook, which will catch a lot of the public heat because of the election and serving as a platform essentially for this sort of nationalist populist movement that Trump and Bannon have ginned up. Does it have international implications? Absolutely. There's just no question that this is something where will you see a Biden administration move closer to the European Union's framework on thinking about some of these issues? Can it be an area, in fact, of cooperation internationally? I don't know, but I do think this is a big issue, and especially when you look at China. And if we're talking about reframing American foreign policy in around sort of a new Cold War framework, that's how this technology conversation is going to be probably the first issue that is a case study of how that actually plays out in reality, I would think.
Yeah, I think that's the one area, Merritt, where we're going to have a really close to a zero-sum competition with China. I don't think that that's just a Trump administration phenomenon. On 5G and artificial intelligence and issues like that, I really expect us to be in a real struggle with China, regardless of which party controls the White House or the Congress. And I don't think that's entirely inappropriate. It's too complicated of an issue to discuss in detail, but that's very different from a broad decoupling of with the Chinese economy.
Yeah, and there are many dimensions, obviously, some which are where national security and economics overlap, and then some, how broad are we being over-inclusive? And what are the consequences? Does it go so far as immigration, for example, which is what was starting to happen in the Trump administration quite dramatically, and affecting students and scientists and so forth. I think that is another dimension that I hope we can get back to and think about. So one other question is really an arms control question, and whether there's a linkage between sort of our likely deficit and an argument for arms control that might create more momentum around arms control. Steve Biddle, would you care to comment on that?
Well, I mean, I think with respect to arms control, I very much agree with Steve Sestanovich on New START, for instance, which is the low-hanging fruit here. I think that's it. The way forward is straightforward. I think the Biden administration is likely to be enthusiastic about it, in part because it lets them put Russia in the done box and focus on other things that they care about more. Arms control vis-a-vis Iran, I think, is a heavier lift, but still readily doable. And as we discussed earlier, is likely to move forward. A broader arms control agenda, however, I don't expect to take shape in any aggressive way anytime soon, because it's a heavy lift. As we saw throughout the Cold War, arms control negotiations are hard, they're long, they require a lot of senior attention to move anywhere, because they necessarily involve making concessions on security issues that people care about a lot and feel threatened by a lot. And therefore, if you want to move anywhere, important on arms control, do anything major, it requires a lot of caloric expenditure by the US government to bring it about. And my guess is the Biden administration is going to have a lot higher priorities when you get beyond New START and the Iran nuclear deal. And I think the amount of labor required relative to the benefit they see, relative to the other challenges they face, my guess is there probably won't be a lot beyond the two agreements that we talked about.
Thank you very much.
Think to that, arms
Okay.
agreements generally require more money.
Yeah.
Because you build support by saying, okay, I am going to authorize this and that new weapon system so as to get support from the Senate Armed Services Committee and so forth. That may be a problem that the Biden administration just is going to solve by not going forward with the kind of agenda that Steve describes.
I think the INF agreement is dead forever. I don't think the Biden administration will go back to that. The Pentagon is very happy that we're out of that because it allows us to have land-based long-range strike weapons, which a lot of people have wanted for a long time. I don't expect the Biden administration to go back to the INF agreement.
So let me say we've gotten a lot of interesting questions and also opinion in some of these questions, including from students, prospective students, and experts around the world. And I'm sorry we haven't been able to get to all of them. Several have observed that, for example, we had interesting comment from a prospective student in Vietnam saying the Trump administration has built a good image in Vietnam by being tough on China, and hopes that that would continue under the next administration. So there are a lot of observations and questions we can't get to, and I'm sorry for that. But in the 2 minutes remaining, what I'd like to do is just invite our great experts to give their best advice to the next administration. Susan, I know that's not your role as a journalist normally, but you are such an expert. Could I invite you to just get us started and each very briefly?
Well, yeah, you're right. It's not my role, my place. Thank goodness. That's why journalists have the easy job. I will say on a personal level, I'm looking forward to no longer being called an enemy of the people. It's been quite an unsettling few years in Washington, frankly, for anyone who's been a foreign correspondent or even just a foreign policy expert, because we're so used to training our gaze outward. And I think this is just a different moment in US history. And as a sort of a child of 1989, that's when I was graduating from college, and, sort of the end of a previous hinge point in sort of international affairs. It's been something pretty remarkable to see that we're on the other side of that generational moment. And I guess what I would say to the Biden campaign and also to your students is we're just still in the middle of this story. It is very clear to me that we are at one of those moments when the tectonic plates are moving, and we don't know the outcome or where the US is going to come up. And that's very unusual. I mean, I operated for most of my adult life in a very fixed moment in terms of assumptions about America and its place in the world. And that's changing now in a pretty dramatic way. I think it makes for an interesting time to be a student of international relations, for sure. But I think it's going to be an extremely challenging time, in all truth, for Biden, and not only because of the Republicans in the Senate.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
The most normal conversation I've had. I'm kind of looking forward to a little bit of boring policy wonk.
Okay. Well, you could have advised on how to deal with the press. That may be another piece.
That's easy.
Pardon me?
Tell the truth.
Tell this truth. Okay, very good. Steve Sestanovich.
I can't think of a time in the past 20 years when we would have had this conversation without more attention to the Middle East.
Yep.
It's hardly come up. And I think that reflects a change in national priorities. It slightly reflects the composition of this panel, but I think it also reflects the way we're thinking about problems. And my advice to the Biden administration would be do everything that you can to keep that reduced priority possible, you know?
Okay, thank you. Thank you. I think we're almost out of time for 10 seconds, Stephen Biddle and Tom Christensen. Steve.
Working with Republicans in this environment is going to be like taking a very, very bitter pill for Democrats after 4 years of Trump. But if we don't do it, we're headed for failed state status and a diminished role in the world. My advice to the Biden administration is suck it up and deal with these people.
I'll say something philosophical. I think the United States needs to approach policy with more confidence, foreign policy with more confidence than we have in recent years. We've done much better than the current narrative allows. We have 60 plus security partners and allies. China has maybe one or two. We have no repeats of 9/11 after quite a long period of time. We have a WTO that we joined, and our exports to China increased faster than our imports from China since then. And we should start saying some positive things about our current foreign policy portfolio and the history of our foreign policy portfolio, so that we don't come across internationally as we have, as looking like victims and looking like whiners when we're the most powerful country on earth.
Thank you very much. It's been a fantastic conversation. Really enjoyed it. Great insights. Thank you on behalf of Columbia and SIPA. Great to be with you all. Thank you.
Thanks, Merritt.
Thanks so much.